Well, I still want to start, even though who knows where a lot of the folks are, but I do have this on, so they can, if they, I'm sorry how horrible my video skills are. I just turn the camera on and just leave it sit there. So, and in fact, I usually even forget it's going, so I discover later that.
Where is it posted then?
Oh, okay,
'Cause
so.
maybe I didn't look really hard, but I was trying to see.
So, let me back up. So this is my main webpage,
Yeah.
and on that I posted a thing I called a blog. It's actually a free blog that you could get from Google.
That's right. Maybe
And so it actually ended up being posted Saturday, because by the time I did it, it was late enough at night that it called it, I don't get to call it what day it is, I guess. Or if I can, I don't know how. I just wrote here that we had the 2 classes, and I usually say, okay, so I posted the movie here, so if you just click on the here, it'll take you to the video.
On, for about 2 hours of the
But last week I forgot to turn the camera on for the second half. I got it all ready, and then I forgot to turn it on.
it happens.
Then the other way you could do that is if you just go to my YouTube link. That's where I post, so you could see them. They should all be there. I don't know how I ended up with 2 YouTube accounts. I think it was UAA's fault, because at one point they said, we're going to save money. Instead of having your own UAA sponsored account, everybody has to switch to Gmail. And they gave us all our UAA Gmail accounts. And when they did that, suddenly I ended up with 2 logins on YouTube somehow. So ever since then, I've had YouTube too. So
It's
that's where.
usually safe to blame it on UAA.
Pardon?
It's usually safe to blame it on UAA if it's under a.
Well, let's face it, they're guilty for a lot of
I
things.
worked for them for almost 10 years, so that
Did you guys get the call at 1 a.m. the other night? I was like, who's this? And then,
yeah.
or was it an attack or something?
Yeah.
Oh, I got an email, I didn't get a call about it.
Yeah.
We got the call.
I got a call and a text
And
and an email.
I
Like
think.
Yeah, that's what I got.
Yeah.
So what do you want me to do, like drive over there?
Yeah.
Just avoid the area, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't walk around
Yeah.
midnight or later.
We wanted to make sure that in case you were thinking about going walking at 1 a.m. by the West Hall, which,
Well,
you
people
know.
live on campus. so-
Especially at 0
Yeah.
degrees.
Exactly, there could be students coming home from a performance or something, I mean, who knows?
Yeah,
Like,
they have that
really
kids
late
at the
performance.
airlines at one
Mhm.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I live right next to the main campus, so I'm like, it takes me a minute to get to campus, so.
Yeah, better safe than sorry, but I
Should
think
we
you
have
can
space
change the way the
parking?
notification comes, so
You can.
it'll only come one way or something, but, yeah. But yeah, I did get it.
I remember I do have an office. It's in the admin building on main campus on room 277. And I remember one day I was sitting there and on my computer, and I had the phone, which is part of the phone system and everything. And my wife called and said that she had just gotten an alert from UAA that there was a bear around my building. I thought, that's pretty funny that they called my home phone,
Yeah,
and
but.
I'm sitting right here, and they didn't tell me anything right here, you know, and that was where the bear was, right? So, yeah, I love UAA. I'm not gonna complain about UAA being silly. That's,
Well, 'cause
human
they'll never
beings.
change. So you
yes,
shouldn't-
as
you
human
shouldn't bother
beings being the way
complaining.
we are, and I'm just as guilty, I'm sure, in a lot of the things I do. It's part of life.
Yeah.
And UAA is still a pretty darn cool place. I could promote it for lots of reasons. I'm surprised a lot of people end up leaving Alaska to go to other universities, especially for undergraduate years, because I think when you get right down to it, UAA is a much cheaper option for people here. And, you know, I know a lot of people who got their degrees in universities in the lower 48 felt like those were great experiences, and by comparison, they think UAA isn't as good. Now, they're probably right. But they got their degree at that university 20, 30 years ago,
Yeah.
and it's
come a
the
long way.
culture that has changed. And our culture here is the same as down there, and you're gonna have the same kinds of problems down there now at those universities. So their memory of those universities doesn't mean that those universities are the same kind of institution they are today as they were then, because they have the internet too. And if you think about what's really transforming our intellectual culture, our milieu, is clearly the kind of thing that the internet's changing the way we do things, the way we research, the way we learn. And notice I'm trying to use it. So I'll be trying to use it for all my classes, not just this one, of course. It might drive you crazy. Some professors feel like, you know, the class time is the time where you sit there and you read a text and discuss a text, because that's what education used to be. But what is the education for? It's so that you can be prepared for life, for the different kinds of employment that's out there, for the kinds of problems that you could deal with in life, and the text-based education that was all we really had years ago. I mean, I grew up with that too, right? You read books, that's how you get an education. That's not the way it works today. It's not even the most efficient. You know, if I compare spending time reading a text, which I can learn a lot from, but then watch a video, it seems to me that the video can be much more powerful as a medium of education than the text was. So it's not surprising that people are prefer to watch videos than to read for hours in a text. I mean, you might want to do both, and that's probably good. I don't know if I mentioned the Flynn effect last class. James Flynn, I can show you James Flynn. In fact, I could let James Flynn talk for himself. So this is
to people who confront a very complex world. And it's a world where we've had to develop new mental habits, new habits of mind.
So I'll just show you that much. It's a TED Talk. Look up James Flynn if you want to watch it. It's interesting, and only about 15 minutes. And his basic point is a statistical one, that each cohort tends to be better at taking tests, like IQ tests and other tests of that sort. And so statistically, they seem to be getting smarter. In fact, IQ-wise, they seem to be gaining in their IQ. It's in a way hidden because the test makers have made the tests harder. Every so often, they increase the difficulty level of the tests, so that if you're getting 100, so you have 100 IQ, it's actually much higher than it would have been if you had taken the same test about 40 years ago, et cetera, right? But so then the question is, how do we account for this? That's his concern. It's referred to as the Flynn effect, although he didn't name it that. It was Charles Murray that gave it that title in his book, The Bell Curve, where he's really talking about the nature of intelligence. And but his explanation for it is that you're immersed in a much more abstract learning environment from your whole childhood on, so that basically you're dealing with those kinds of questions that are in the tests that people weren't involved in before. But I also like to think that because you're constantly in touch with your devices, music, you know, I mean, your mind is literally exercising much more of the time during the day than it used to be years ago. I can imagine being a farmer, being out in the field with no social interaction or entertainment or anything except work for the whole day, except maybe Saturday and Sunday, you know, when he might have conversations at home, Sunday go to church for about 3 hours or something in the afternoon, right? So, you know, his mind is only being exercised by the physical labor that he's involved with and that sort of thing. Whereas today, your mind is on Google, you're aware of what's going on in the news, you know, moment by moment. You're, you know, Facebooking friends and texting and all that stuff, and you're constantly knowing what's going on in the world right at the moment as it's happening. So it's just incredibly mentally demanding exercise, which in a sense, if you think of the mind as a muscle, which it is, right? The more you use a muscle, the stronger it gets. So that strikes me as another reason why young people today tend to be quicker, faster at solving problems but there's also a problem with the way they do things, and that's something that James Flynn talks about too, and that is our capacity for dealing with long-form problems or long-form reading, because that's a skill too. And of course, what the society used to do is, you know, you'd go to the library and you'd read for 3 hours or longer, right, and look at other books, and you'd be concentrating on long arguments. Well, today, if you're used to short video clips and text messages and things of that sort, and you're not spending time reading long texts, you lose that skill, and that still seems to be the way that we load a lot of information, a lot of data into our heads, like history, you know, details, things of that sort. So there's got to be a balance. You know, if you're just using the new machines and doing short messages and reading short texts, then you're losing the skill that is the long process by which we can solve difficult, hard to solve problems, right? So you're on the one hand much quicker, much more intelligent in a sense. You're more agile intellectually, but if you're not also trying to learn, you know, and read whole texts so that you know what we still think of as what gives you the education, so that you know where our Constitution came from, where science develops from, and so on. You know, if you're not reading those books, you're not getting that kind of education. I know the one night, it was Wednesday a week ago, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I stopped at Barnes and Noble's. I always call it Barnes and Ig Noble's just for fun. And I was looking for something on Galileo. I was looking for this book, actually. I brought it this evening because I came in early this evening and I thought I would have time to read it. So I was looking for this, and the library had it, but it wasn't local. I was going to have to request it, and it actually did come. It took me a while to get it. But so I thought, well, I'll stop at Barnes and Ig Noble's, buy a copy. So I went in and I looked, couldn't find it anyplace. Couldn't find anything on Galileo there. So I went up to the cashier and I said to her, can you look up, do you have anything on Galileo? And she looked at me and she said, oh, he's an artist, isn't he? She was plenty old enough that she's had at least high school plus education. So I was kind of startled. Actually, I guess Galileo was a bit of an artist of some sort, but not really. That wasn't really his specialty. Right? However, so we get a brilliant kind of education that enables us to interact and do things in the modern world, but if you're not also getting the text-based history that you really can't deliver just with a video, you have to read. Like the old encyclopedias, there's an incredible amount of information in a typical like Britannica encyclopedia article that Wikipedia just doesn't deliver. It just isn't there. However, and so I'm trying to be somewhere in between. Because on the one hand, I don't want people to hate my class and not want to come. So I want to be entertaining and not sit here doing page by page analysis of a text. That would probably drive most people crazy today. But on the other hand, that still is part of what we have to try to cover. A goal of a philosophy course, what are the goals for students? The outcomes is for you to be able to read philosophy on your own, right? So if you go and you take out a philosophy book after this course, theoretically you're supposed to be able to read it and figure out what's going on in the text. Of course, everybody has questions and so on. So where are we? Let's talk about the quiz question. And that will take us back to we started the Euthyphro. There's two. I'll start with the Euthyphro. It's not in the text. Right? It used to be, but this version of the text, I guess this is what, edition 6 or 5? I forget which one this is. Oh, it's still in here. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So the Euthyphro. This is supposed to be set up, and in fact, if you look at the Stephanus numbers, so this is a site called the Perseus Project. It's the collection of all the classic texts. I don't know how far up they go, but this is the Euthyphro, Euthyphron in this case, right? But notice that this is also 2 alpha. And where do the numbers come from? They're called Stephanus numbers. So all of the Plato dialogues, all of Plato's dialogues are numbered according to one of the editors that compiled them and put them in a set was named Stephanus. And the page and paragraph number in that original collection is where we get the Stephanus number. So just like if you're familiar with the Bible, you could go to a particular book, chapter, verse, right? So you could so if you see John 12, 23 through 25 or something, you know exactly where you want to go in the Bible to find that particular verse, right? In a sense, this is exactly the same kind of thing here, although the closest you get to is a paragraph, how the paragraph is set up. So this is 2a, right, and so on. I don't know if that's interesting or not. So now this is the Apology. Notice that, so Euthyphro was 2a, this is 17a. So I'm farther along in that original corpus. And they arranged that, they think, in the, so if we think that there's different periods when the dialogues were written, which one was first? Which one was second? Which one was third? That's what Stephanus was trying to do. It doesn't succeed. The main reason we still have the Stephanus numbers is because, well, that works. But in any case, there's still argument over whether or not different dialogues should have been numbered earlier or later. And no one's going to be in agreement. We don't absolutely know. when they were written. We don't have like a biography of Plato and know when he wrote them. In fact, there's even arguments that some of the Platonic dialogues weren't really even written by Plato. Which, especially the letters, there are 7 letters that are attributed to Plato, but some people argue whether or not they were all written by Plato. Did Paul write all of his epistles? You know, the same kind of question you might ask, right? It's so long ago. How do we know? Right? It's also interesting that if Plato was a Pythagorean, didn't actually get up to Pythagoras yet in discussing the ancients, the pre-Socratics, then 12 was a significant number for him, and it seems like everything is arranged in 12s in some kind of a secret kind of way, right? It's also interesting that the very middle of each dialogue, right in the middle, right in exactly the middle, is the word that the dialogue is concerned with, and everything is arranged in 12s and so on. So in a sense, there's kind of an understood kind of symbolic way that the entire dialogues are set up. It's an argument. It's not necessarily something that everybody agrees with, but nonetheless it's there as an interesting possibility. And of course the problem we have with it is that we don't have the original text any place that we could look and see if they are in fact arranged that way. They're all copies of copies of copies, right? So who knows when the text was copied by someone, did they know, well, I got to keep it arranged this way too? They probably didn't. Plus, notice that we have like commas and spaces between the words here. If you look at some of the copies of the original text, it seems like they didn't have spaces, probably didn't have punctuation marks. So, why do they have them here? That's a good question. Notice the same thing would be a concern for Hebrew texts. I think the oldest copy they have of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is a Leningrad Codex, which of course isn't that old. The Dead Sea Scrolls, when they found those, instantly became realized as a much older text, right? Because they were hidden there from the Roman invaders, roughly around 68 AD. And if you figure 68 AD, the one in Leningrad is supposed to be from maybe around the 500 AD. So obviously they've got an older text down there. And there were breath marks in the Dead Sea Scrolls versions of the Hebrew text, and not in the Leningrad Codex. Right? Codex is before they had books, right? They didn't have a codex is kind of book-like, but not quite. So this kind of textual criticism is something that we have to keep in mind, that what we're looking at, not necessarily the original. Not sure that we'll ever be able to find the original. They do keep finding more texts, especially in Egypt. They dig up a new grave site, they find all these tombs, and the typical mummy was wrapped in scrap paper, which could be like your grocery list, could be a letter that you sent to somebody, but it could also end up being copies of Aristotle's texts that were lost. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they keep looking as they unwrap all these mummies. They might have a couple thousand in a field. What do you imagine unwrapping all these mummies and stuff? Another neat thing about this site, by the way, is I'm not sure if you read Greek or not, but if we want to change it, we just change the focus. So now I'm in English, and it does tell you who these translations are by. There's obviously various translations, although you're only going to have, I think, the one in the Perseus Project. But if I go back, notice that another way to do it is if I just look at a particular word, I can look it up, and it'll give me categoris, right? Category, right? In fact, somewhere in here it should have the English of that, or speak against.
And what was this thing again?
Ah, okay, so this is so that's a separate page there, actually. This is called the Perseus Project.
I'm sure you have a link in the links.
I might, maybe not. In my bibliography, I think I do. I'm positive I do. But if you just remember Perseus, remember Perseus's ship? Yes? You know, so that's kind of famous as a story itself. So he was the one after the Golden Fleece, right? I'm old enough that my mind doesn't work. Jason. That was Jason. Well, who was Perseus?
Perseus was one of the sons of Zeus. Just like, only he wasn't like Hercules.
Perseus was the one that killed Medusa.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, with the shield and the, because you don't want to look at her otherwise. What an interesting mythological story that she was so ugly that if you saw her face, it would kill you. Let's not try to figure out what the Greeks were thinking with that one. So, good, my tea is cool enough I can drink it now. Phew. It's the trouble with these modern apparati. You know, they're so efficient, they keep the thing so hot that you could burn yourself hours later instead of, you know. Okay, so the Euthyphro. The Euthyphro precedes the Apology. Theoretically, even in the Euthyphro, Socrates is standing there talking to a priest who's in line waiting for his trial. So that's, you know, who's next here? And Euthyphro is a fun name for me. I remember I just had one course in Greek, so my Greek is terrible, but at least I get to play with it, and I have a dictionary, but you could also just look it up here. And Euthyphro, EU is the prefix that means good. So we see that in a lot of English words like euthanasia, which doesn't really mean the good kids that come from Asia. You know, that's euthanasia is a good death, right? Right. But so EU is good. Then theo is the Greek word for God. So a theologian is someone studying theologos, studying the logic or the order, or studying God. You know, so trying to understand the nature of the divine. And then phronesis is analysis. So Euthyphro is essentially good God analysis. So Euthyphro is a specialist. He understands God's. He's a theologian, basically, right? And he's a specialist on piety, which is what Socrates is being charged in the Apology as not being pious, right? It's one of the charges against him. So here he is, happenstance, next to this young man who's a specialist in God, and he's there, as we find out in the Euthyphro, in order to charge his father with killing his slave, Euthyphro's slave. So apparently, Euthyphro's slave and his father's slave had some sort of fight. The father tied up Euthyphro's slave, threw him in a ditch, didn't really watch him while they were waiting for the priest to come and settle the dispute. And while the poor guy was in the ditch became full of water, and the slave drowned by accident, actually, I guess. So Euthyphro is upset, wants to charge his father with murdering his slave. And Socrates, you just read through in between the lines, you get the sense that Socrates doesn't think that's really something a son ought to be doing, charging his father with a crime like that. After that's just a slave anyway. Sorry about that, but yeah, right? Get that impression. But so he comes up with this idea, though, since Euthyphro knows what's pious to do, and obviously charging his father for murder, is a pious thing to do, then it would be great if while they were waiting to get into the trial, that Euthyphro would teach Socrates all about piety. Right? What is piety? How can I be pious? Because they're going to punish me for not being pious. I'm a dumb old guy who's almost 79 years old, right? And so, at least what I could do is defend myself by saying, I know I wasn't behaving right, or everybody's mad at me for not being pious, but I found Euthyphro, who's a specialist on piety, and he's going to teach me all about piety. So I'm taking lessons on piety. And Euthyphro thinks, oh, that'll be great. Wonderful. Okay, I'll teach you all there is to know about how to be pious. And so Socrates, so what is piety? And we get a first definition. And this is typical of the way these dialogues work. I think I mentioned last time, remember that once Plato starts writing, I know it could be confusing. Socrates is the character, but Plato's the author, right? So in this writing, it seems to be the first occasion in human history where we have, at least as far as we know, at least in the West. I'm not familiar with Indian texts and Chinese texts, but I mean, this is the thought, right? That this is the first place where abstract concepts are trying to be understood. They're created. We're creating them. If you think of it this way, it's not like piety was always something out there, and everyone kind of had an intuitive sense of how to be pious. This is the invention of the concept piety. Does that make sense? It's the first that occurs in the language. If you think, well, before you had it in the language, then people didn't think it, right? So this is the beginning of abstract concepts. And what Socrates is asking is, what is it? What does it mean? What is piety? And Euthyphro gives him his first answer, and that is doing what the gods love. Pretty easy, right? Pretty easy? No, not easy. Why? Well, we have so many gods, right? Did we already talk about this? Like Zeus, for example, loves going around as a swan or a bull, right? He likes to fool around. Perseus was one of his children?
Yes.
Was that from Leda? Was that one of the four? No.
I'm not sure.
I mean, I remember as a kid reading Bullfinch's mythology, and you know what? I don't remember hardly any of that. And that wasn't the only mythology out there either. But, in any case, doing what the gods love. If Zeus loves to fool around, and I want to grow up to be a good male that's pious to Zeus, I ought to imitate the god and go out and have lots of affairs or whatever, right? But meanwhile, Hera, who's Zeus's wife, is in charge of hours. Hera, hours, order, including matrimony, right? Marriage. That's like what structures society. Even today, Charles Murray, in his book Falling Apart, talks about the things that really hold a society together. There's, I think, as I recall, there are 4 things you need to do in order for a society to hold together. One is you have to, not in order, but one is you have to get married and stay married, so that the children have a father and mother, That's an important part of a stable society. You have to be industrious, work hard. You have to be honest with other people, tell the truth and stuff. And you have to go to church every Sunday. Doesn't matter what church, but the idea that you're a part of a community and you have obligations, it's your week to bring the casserole, that kind of thing. People are depending on you, you're interrelated with them in different ways, right? So those are 4 things Charles Murray talks about as important. By the way, as far as he's concerned, they're all falling apart in our country. So that's kind of scary. However, Hera is in charge of marriage. That's part of the order of the society. The Greeks thought that as well. And so if I'm going to be pious to Hera, I'm going to be impious to Zeus, and vice versa, right? So how does this work? How am I pious to one or the other? And Euthyphro really can't solve that problem. Socrates has hit a really important nail on the head, so to speak, in this particular argument. So Euthyphro is confused. And so Socrates offers to help by refining the question. So he says, is it pious, or is the pious pious because the gods love it? Or do the gods love the pious because it's pious? Did I do that very well? You get it? Sometimes I could get those confused, right? So if Zeus loves fooling around and what's pious is what Zeus loves, then fooling around should be the pious. But if, on the other hand, there is the pious, the good way to live, and Zeus likes that, right? Then you see the difference is instead of the god liking whatever the heck the god likes, and that's what we all have to imitate, or if there's some kind of good arrangement in the world where there's the best and the worst, and the gods know it, and so by imitating what the gods like, we're actually imitating the good, right? That's the question he asks, right? And at this point, Euthyphro is so confused, he just leaves, which I think is exactly the point that Euthyphro is hoping for, because the poor kid is so confused. This master of confusion is just basically disrupted his whole way of thinking, and off he goes. Mad at Socrates, which, by the way, is probably why they're putting him on trial for being impious. This is precisely what gets Socrates in trouble, right? Because people hate how he does this to you. Because they thought they're the wise people, right? But here's the interesting thing about this. This is a significant question. Because when the priesthood class thinks they know what the gods love and want to tell you, God wants you to do such and such, and we ask them, how do you know? Is it a God's voice told me in a whirlwind, or a burning bush, or a little bird whispered in my ear, or where did they find out what the God wanted? Well, is it something that we could reason out, use our own intelligence to figure out? We could go back, wow, where did the fall happen? What was the fall? Anybody remember the fall?
Is that what we're talking about? The Garden of Eden?
The Garden of Eden, right? Where that's... Did they actually tell Eve not to eat the fruit of that tree? Or was it just Adam that they told? He, whoever.
I think it was just Adam.
It was just Adam.
Just Adam.
She was created after.
In one of the stories. They were created together in one of... Are you familiar with Lilith?
The first wife of Adam.
that's kind of a hidden agenda, isn't it?
Mhm.
She was a feminist. She didn't behave, basically. This has nothing to do with anything, but if you're a Harry Potter fan, notice Harry Potter's mother's name is Lily. And I interpret that as a nickname for Lilith, although there are people that, no, because they know where I'm going with it, right? That Harry's mother is essentially the one side in this, right? And Voldemort, clearly the other side, so that you look at the entire conflict as between Lily and Voldemort, and especially in the last, where we look at this is Lily's theme. This is the theme, the music in the movie that keeps coming up as all these sad kind of things, you know, like the death of when Voldemort dies. It's Lily's theme that plays. So just thought I'd throw them in. Sorry about that, but that's. How many of you hate Harry Potter? Nobody. It's kind of interesting. Did some of you grow up with Harry Potter? So you,
I wasn't allowed to read Harry Potter because it would turn me into a satanic blah, blah,
My
blah.
parents said the same thing. Yep.
so have you looked at the book since, or is that still on your?
No, I watched a couple of the movies and I don't know. Not my thing.
I don't know how people could watch the movies and actually make sense out of them, because unless you have, you know the books and then you're disappointed because the movies don't show some of your favorite things. But the books, of course, are much different. And there's whole subplots that are never even addressed in however. But so this is kind of interesting to me. Lily strikes me as that's the, because J.K. Rowling had a double first in classics and French in school, so she's familiar with all the ancient Greek stories. And yes, she's using them. It's loaded with those stories. And by the way, it's absolutely Christian. Her, just, in fact, she's furious with people that don't see it. You know, that's okay. Sorry about that. Nothing about your mom, and gosh, I'm sorry, I got all these nude guys on the beach. There's the Stephanus pagination. I was going to show you that when I talked about it. Okay, so the question that Socrates poses, Euthyphro, is considered to be like the question that really puts the priesthood on the spot. It's where do they get the authority to tell us what the gods want? Even if they're using scripture, it's their interpretation of the scripture, etc. You know, you get to this conflict where you think, okay, on the one hand, we ought to be able to use our intelligence, even if we didn't really fall or not. You know, if Eve didn't really eat the fruit that we weren't supposed to eat, and then as a result, we got kicked out of paradise. And what exactly is that all about? We'll see when we talk about Augustine that he feels that it's a metaphor, that didn't actually have a garden, didn't actually have a particular fruit that Adam was told not to eat, etc. But it's basically becoming human instead of being an animal. So we have language, we have consciousness, and so we think about things and we decide that we don't like something. So it's our point of view that introduces evil into the world. It's not like, so if I think that tree is evil, you should cut it down. It's not that the tree is evil, it's my feeling about the tree that makes it evil. It's harder to talk about that when, like, there's a flood that wipes out 1 million people. You feel like, well, that was evil. You might say, well, you know, it was just nature taking its course. Those 1 million people shouldn't have been living that close to an ocean that can be pretty angry occasionally. We just had that tsunami warning, which, you know, brings that kind of thought up, right? But so that's kind of the one theme associated with the fall, is that becoming an intelligent species was the fall. So that being smart enough to feel like this is good and this is bad, that's the fall. However, where does the good come from? So that seems to be the question. And when I asked you as a quiz question, if Jesus came to your door, you know, and knocked, you know, and you opened the door, hypothetically, you know it's Jesus. A lot of folks responded, well, how do I know? Could be just a bum off the street, right? True. And in fact, I love this song. Should I do this to us? I don't know. What if God was one of us? I don't even have to type the whole thing. Have you heard this song?
Oh, one of these nights and about 12 o'clock, this old rock's gonna reel and rock.
That's not the
Thanks,
song
Bill
I
Campbell and
thought.
Kaiser sang, for the Lord's gonna come in his.
What would it look like and would you want to see?
That is the same song? I didn't know it started with that other thing. So I don't know I haven't analyzed that song in all its fullness to know what the heck it's all about. But when I saw some of the email responses, what if he was just a bum coming up, you know, knocking at the door and saying he's Jesus? And I said, yeah, what if God were one of us, just a slob, like, you know, one of us? You know, I think of the song. But hypothetically, this is really Jesus, and he is really God, and he asks you a question, which basically is in John, I think, that says, sorry, John, but, you know, the other John.
Lots of us around.
Yeah, that, you know, that's what he expects us to do if we want to be saved, in a sense, right? You get that? Do you ever hear that? You've heard that? Sell everything, have, you know, degauge yourself of all the accoutrements of a happy life, basically. Down to nothing, basically, and then follow. And it's supposedly a real question. I mean, let's face it, when I think about what that means, I think of the holy orders that a lot of people still today, they take the vow of poverty, join a religious order, where they decide they are not going to have property, they're going to avoid the kinds of happiness that we think. That's the whole point of having a happy life, is to have, you know, a nice house, you know, a nice car, happy children, you know, all that stuff. You know, no, we're going to just follow Jesus. And they do. I mean, the nuns I had all taken the vow of poverty. They had no property. The Augustinian monks in my high school, all the same. No one owned anything. My one Father Bonacorsi had a car that a friend lent him. So that was kind of sly, right? You know, so he had a car, parked it in the monastery lot. He was the only one that drove it. He didn't have to pay anything for, you know, gas. He had to, you know, I guess he had to get gas. But, you know, it was a really crappy car, actually. But, so there are people that live like that. So that's how they interpret that. But an awful lot of you said, "No, I couldn't imagine doing that. I like my stuff. I work hard to get it. I enjoy it. So I'm not going to give it up, etc." And I thought, good American answer, right? You know, good American answer, because the American kind of consumer attitude is that, you know, we the people, you know, we've got all of this government for our benefit, right? Does that make sense?
Like, from my standpoint, that hypothetical question has happened throughout history. There's very little difference between that hypothetical question and David Koresh.
Oh.
Which ended tragically, so.
Really?
Yeah, well, how do I answer that? Because, you know, on the one hand, I
That would
was,
be a good philosophical debate.
yeah, because you know,
But
the
he's not Jesus, he just.
No, he claimed to be the Son of God.
Right.
Yeah. And those people
And-
find everything.
But there are a lot of.
now that brings up the
And
question:
he
what
left
kind of
everything to go stay at his compound.
what kind of rifle would Jesus use? You know, now that's the thing. You know, I mean, if
Probably the best one, I guess.
would it be an Uzi? I mean, he was
When
Jewish.
somebody, gave him.
I mean, an Uzi, right? The Uzis are the Israeli weapon. So, being a rabbi, I don't know. Of course, my favorite is, what kind of car would Jesus drive? And the answer is a Honda, because then we'd all be in one accord. That's, you know, that's,
You see, they gave someone gifted the Pope like a Lamborghini.
he's not going to use that. What's he going to do with that? You know, he's driving some kind of
They all,
Lada or something. I
everybody
don't
stood
know.
around the Lamborghini and like they all prayed. That's great.
He won't even wear the red slippers, you know. So that's his. But now that would be the kind of person that, you know, if he told me, "Come and follow me," well, it's too late. My wife would say no. You know, she nixed that whole idea, you know. But there's an individual that we could look at, and I could think, you know, alcohol, drugs, and tobacco folks are not going to attack the Pope, you know, when he arrives. You know. Another answer you could have given, though, is as soon as you saw Jesus at your door, you could call the police and report an illegal alien that you're, you know, on the front, you know, because he doesn't have a passport or anything, right? It wasn't like his parents came here to have him born. They went to Bethlehem, right? So. Have you seen the movie The Star? We saw it a couple weeks ago. It's all about how the donkey and the sheep and all the other animals basically made it possible for Joseph and Mary to get to the Bethlehem to have the baby. And they're fighting the Herod's evil guy that's trying to get them and stuff. A lot of artistic liberty taken in that movie. However, so the neat thing about this question then is, to me, is Jesus would like you to basically live the aesthetic life, right? The life where you've given up all attachments to physical things. And by the way, the Buddhist monks ask the same thing. So it's not just Christian. It's like any of the holy orders in any of the religions, and Islam, even if you're not in a holy order, ask that the good life be one where you're avoiding attachment to the physical pleasures that we think of as the wonderful things about the modern life, right? So, for example, in Islam, imams think that music is haram or evil, right? Think about your favorite symphony orchestra from Iran. Not, right?
It's interesting because they sing to call to prayer.
Right, but
So it's like,
is that considered a music that's supposed to be joyful, you know, to make you feel happy, or is it more of an order? Now it's time to pray.
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of, it's just like hearing church bells, I guess.
Yeah, well, but I think in the Christian tradition, church bells are musical.
Right.
And it's not illegal for you to use music. In fact, the musical history of the West really blossomed in the churches. I mean, there were clearly other musics besides those through the church, but the liturgical church music was absolutely amazing up until the Reformation. And then, oddly, the Lutherans felt that you should not have all these earthly distractors in the church, so they whitewashed the walls, got rid of all the rich icons and everything. Didn't even have the crucifix anymore, right? Because, you know, that was, who knows, maybe that would be erotic, seeing a nearly naked guy suffering to death on a cross. I don't know, but they just used the cross instead of the crucifix. Right, the difference between the crucifix and the cross is just the two pieces that are across, whereas the crucifix is where you actually have the image, the statue, or however, of Jesus crucified on the cross itself, right? So you notice if you go into most, at least the old Catholic churches, you'll have the, you know, absolutely horrific image of a bleeding, you know, crown of thorns, blood dripping all over, you know, hanging on the cross, absolute suffering. Whereas more modern churches, they just have, you know, the cross, etc. And yet, despite that Lutheran propensity to do away with all the art, Bach is Lutheran.
Actually, the Lutherans didn't do away with all of the art.
No.
They just they cleaned house quite a bit, but actually they celebrate art quite a bit as well, even in Germany and some of the old temples, but definitely in the United States. So
It's much more refined. It's not Baroque. It's not
there's
gaudy
a lot
to
of
the.
blood and guts.
Yeah.
but-
They don't actually have dead bodies sitting over the altar, which I remember in one church in, not Wiesbaden, Wies, I think was the name of the town. They had a, it's absolutely hilarious, but the German word for a seminary is a Stift, S-T-I-F-T, like the Tübingen Stift is the seminary where Hegel went. But in this one particular stift at Wies, V-E-I-S-S as I recall, they had dead bodies all around the church. So I was thinking, this is a stift museum. It's the seminary museum, but it's also hilarious because in English we call a dead body a stiff. So it's stuck in my head. But yeah, you come up and you would kneel at the altar, and above the altar is this gold encrusted, jewelry encrusted skeleton lying there looking at you. And it's like, what were they thinking? You know, this is pretty.
But I will agree with you, most of the Lutheran, especially the old-time English churches, are a lot more clean than the
They were
Catholic.
iconoclasts.
Yes.
They believed in destroying the icons. But Bach is incredibly sensuous. I listen, oh my goodness.
It might not be just Lutheran groups that make it that way, but I'll go with it.
This is absolutely one of my favorites. And the soprano is, I think, one of the sexiest women alive. Sorry, but, I'm being honest with you. I say what I think. Is that okay? I think it's her eyes. Look at her eyes when she's singing. She's just so, the depth of intelligence is just amazing. I think. It's just me.
It's okay, Jameson, just slowly dig yourself out of the hole, it's fine.
I'll dig it deeper when I. Except it's beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful church that they're in. It's all painted white compared to the Sistine Chapel. This is, see, she's doing other stuff. There's some Handel. So.
I see it.
Okay. I realize I'm male and social subtlety just, you know, it goes right by. However, okay, so, what else?
What's her name?
Núria Real.
Oh.
She's Portuguese, I believe. Europeans, they go all over the place. Like, what languages do you speak? Well, you know, the way they do it. And they smoke pot, you know, so I don't know how you can smoke pot and know all those languages and live at that speed. You know, it's just, actually, I don't know if she smokes pot. Probably not. I don't. Okay. So the Euthyphro, the significance of it as a perfect example of what gets Socrates in trouble, but also presenting the problem of how do the priesthood authorities get their authority. You know, when it seems like we ought to be able to think for ourselves to figure out what the good is. Now that's pride, by the way. That's the sin of pride, thinking that you can do that you could figure it out, as opposed to having to have God tell you what it is through the priesthood class to tell you what the good is, right? So, interesting question. But then we go on to the apology. And now this is the trial of Socrates. I played the funny little skit, from Steve Martin, The Death of Socrates. I hope you didn't think that was really very realistic, because it's not. They don't have Chinese food in Athens at the time. Apollo is involved. Anybody remember how? How is Apollo involved in the apology? Apology, right? So if you think the name of these dialogues is an indicator of the topic. So why is Apollo involved in the apology, the defense? Anybody remember?
Was it,
Chaerephon, he's the one who gets the message, right?
yeah.
Goes to the Delphi Oracle, the Delphic Oracle. There's videos of it, by the way. I don't know if not the software, by the way.
The legendary Oracle. Together, they hoped to document the presence of a fault line, a find that would contradict all the accepted scientific evidence about this mysterious site.
So it's there. It's a tourist trap. At least if you follow it, you can see that there's big buses all around the place all the time, lots of parking. So it's clearly one of the big places that a lot of people go. Just because of this, well, it's not just because of Socrates, but it is a famous place. It was considered the belly button of the world by the Greeks. So like the place really where creation began. There's a geological fault there that actually crosses, and right at the place where the two faults cross is where the temple is built, right over it. So the priestesses would sit under, the temple had rooms, and down in the basement where this fault crossed over was where they had the priestess sitting on a tripod, which is also significant. Tripods were very expensive and very special, but the tripod seat was sitting right over this crack, and the priestess would sit there and inhale the fumes coming up from this volcanic fault, which would asphyxiate them. Right. So there's like records that some days the fumes were too bad, so the priestesses would complain and say it's too bad today, and that irritated the priests because they weren't going to make any money if the priestesses didn't do their job, right? So you get the conflict there. But so the poor priestess would be sitting over these fumes, and it would probably, make her kind of woozy, etc. And then people would line up, pay their fee, and come down and ask their question of the oracle. And of course, the oracle would always give them a weird answer, right? One that if you attack so-and-so today, a great army will be destroyed. Oh, really? Right, the famous general goes off, attacks the enemy, and his army is the great army that was destroyed, right? They're not really clear about what they're saying. So Chaerephon goes, and he's got this question, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the poor priestess sitting on this stool goes, no. That's at least how they weren't really speaking English, but basically, no. Right? So Chaerephon comes back and informs Socrates that the Apollo oracle, this is the voice of Apollo, the god, right, of reason, right? APO means of or from, and LLO is the root word for logos. So this is from logic. So Apollo is the reason. How many of you have given apologies in your lifetime, right? You've explained the reason why I was late, whatever. Right? So Apollo, through the oracle, has told Chaerephon to tell Socrates that he's the wisest. So that's the mistake that Socrates gets, because as he concludes later, he realizes that it wasn't that he was the wisest, it's that no human being is wiser than anyone else. We're all just as dumb, basically. That's what Socrates concludes, right? But at this point, he gets this message that Apollo thinks he's the wisest, and he thinks, there's no way that I'm the wisest. So he's going to test it. He's going to go and he's going to inquire of all these brilliant guys that are famous in the town, the teachers, right? And a teacher is a wise person, so a sophist, right? Sophist. Right? Sophia is wisdom. Philo, love of Sophia. Philosophia, right? Is love of wisdom, right? So the sophists are teachers, wisdom teachers, but they charge. They take money for it. Right? So this is, very expensive. Only the wealthy can afford to hire them, the best of them at least, in order to teach their kids. And the main thing that they're trying to get their kids to learn is how to be great in oration, to give great speeches, to be wise, basically, to win arguments so that they can become great politicians, right? And wealthy, hopefully. Well, that's the goal. And so there's some famous ones. And there's also famous artists, especially the ones that write the plays, the poets, right? And others that are famous for like training horses and things. If you want your horse trained by the best, go to Joe Snuffy. He's the expert, right? So Socrates goes to these different famous individuals and asks them questions like, what is justice? What is love? What is this? And you get the sense that because they were famous and thought wise in a specialty maybe, they became convinced that they were great in anything. So they began to talk as if they knew everything about everything, which of course none of us know. So the oracle's right about that, I guess, right? We all need to learn from each other and be humble, etc. But there are, of course, these folks that are not. And so the dialogues represent these discussions with these different wise individuals, right? And it always ends up like, well, not always. I have to change that. So there are 3 different periods, they say, right? The first period of Plato's dialogues, Socrates is, and I think I said he was an asshole, right? Last class, right? He's the kind of guy that irritates the heck out of Euthyphro, and Euthyphro gets mad and leaves because he can't answer these questions, right? But Socrates doesn't answer them either. He's wise enough that he asks the kinds of questions that you get all turned around. And imagine, these are symposia, so they're sitting around having dinner and then drinking wine, right? And so this is the evening entertainment, right? So you imagine sometimes the discussions would have gotten a little on the tipsy side, right? But Plato, of course, just focuses on the relatively sane part of the argument. In any case, the individuals that are in the disputes end up really putting their ego totally on the line, and Socrates clearly is fantastic at turning the argument around. So you give a definition and answer to the question, and everyone thinks, oh, that's a good, so like, what is justice? Well, the interest of the stronger, for example, right? I had to learn, right? Interest of the stronger. Basically the idea that might makes right, right? And by the way, that's not necessarily that the strong get whatever they want. It's that the strong impose their ethical point of view on the others. Does that make sense? It's not just that the bullies get their way. It's that the bullies impose their ethical beliefs on everyone else. Does that make sense? So a perfect example of this kind of thing, and I'm fully American and fully thrilled that we won the Second World War, et cetera. But, you know, when you look at the aftermath of that, and the Nazis were put on trial by the Allies in Nuremberg, and asked them questions, why did you kill these 250 civilians? We were ordered to, right? So why was that? Well, you know, there were some terrorists among them, and when our troops went through the town, the terrorists attacked our troops and killed 25 of them, and the orders came down that we were supposed to line up the first 250 civilians in the town that we could find, shoot them all, and warn the town that this is what's going to happen every time any of our men get attacked. Right? So that apparently happened in one of the Italian towns. So they were following orders, killed those 250 people. Well, we didn't think that that was just, right, in the court, right? We said that's against what we create eventually as the Geneva Convention, right? You know, you're not allowed to kill civilians. Right? Well, that was our moral point of view that we imposed on the Nazis. The Nazis' moral view was that you do what the state tells you. It's a Stoic ethical system, a good military ethical system. You know, the commander tells you to do something, you don't question the order, you do it. You know, you don't try to figure out, right? You know, you don't try to figure out, hey, you know, why should I kill all these Vietnamese? You know, the colonel told me to do it, right? Oh, that's, of course, Lieutenant Calley, right? Anybody get the EBGBs from talking about Vietnam and all that sort of thing? Remember, Lieutenant Calley ended up going to jail for like 2 weeks, something like that, wasn't it? Anybody keep track of any of that? No. He was the scapegoat for that My Lai massacre, right? Well, we're kind of